All right, next up in the review lineup, we have the Unno Ikki. So our last bike, the Unno Mith, was pretty polarizing. You either loved that thing or you hated it. This bike is very, very similar. In fact, it's basically identical in terms of travel, geometry, intended application, except it has a lightweight motor and a half-size battery. All right, a couple of high-level details before we go ride. The Unno Ikki is a long-travel, lightweight eMTB that uses the TQ HPR 50 drive system and a 360 watt-hour battery. It comes in at a really respectable 42.6 pounds, making it about 8 pounds lighter than the full power Mith. So just like with the Mith, the setup is extremely finicky. I'm not going to take the time to complain about it again. If you want to see why I don't love that, just go watch the Mith video. But also, like the Mith, once you get it set up, the ride quality makes that headache worth it. Let's jump into the ride review section of this video by talking about the TQ HPR 50 drive system. Mountain bikes are a game of compromises and trade-offs. Some compromises had to be made to make the Ikki as light and sleek and maneuverable as it is. And those compromises look like reduced power and reduced range. You'll notice those compromises the most on the climbs, and then you'll notice the pros of those compromises the most on the descents. There's some really great things about the TQ system. First of all, it's extremely natural and subtle. It's also very quiet. Both of those things are great for the riders who want an e-bike, but they still want to work quite a bit on the climbs and have as close to a normal bike-like experience as possible. Secondly, the TQ system is very neat and tidy. The controller is really small, unobtrusive, sits over on just the side of the bars. The screen on the top tube is not giant, glaring, bright. It's pretty subtle and subdued. The screen does offer quite a bit of information though for being so basic and minimal. It has a bunch of different screens you can flip through, and there's some pretty good info on there. All in all, TQ has done a great job of making their e-bike system as close to an analog bike as possible. So they get a couple of gold stars for that. Now, this is my first experience with the TQ system. I've spent a lot of time on other e-bike systems as well as other lightweight e-bike systems like the Fazua and the Shimano EP8 RS. And both of those systems offer 60 Newton meters of peak torque. The TQ HPR 50 offers 50 Newton meters of torque. Even though it's only 10 Newton meters less, it is fairly noticeable on the climbs. Remember, most full power e-bikes are in the 85 to 90 range these days. On flatter terrain, the TQ feels powerful enough and offers some good yet not overwhelming assistance. It's when you get on the steep stuff that you notice that it's not quite as powerful as everything else that's out there. So the motor struggled to carry my 200-pound frame up some of the steepest stuff without a significant amount of effort on my part. One of the info screens you can toggle to shows the bike's output in watts and the rider's output in watts. And on those steepest climbs, I would see that the bike was peaking at about 300 watts, which is its max wattage. But then I was having to put in 400 to 500 to 600 watts at times to be able to keep climbing. I don't really think you'd have to put out 600 watts yourself on other e-bike systems. So I found myself wanting just a little bit more love and assistance out of that motor. And because I found myself maxing out the motor's wattage and peak torque frequently, I did notice some reduced range. So it's really tough to provide an exact number of how many vertical feet you're going to get on this system. But for me, a 200-pound rider in full boost, I'm getting about 1,800 vertical on a battery. TQ does offer a range extender, so you can get an extra 160 watt hours of capacity. All that said, this is not the e-bike for big days out in the woods. Keep in mind, I can only speak to my perspective as a 200-pound rider. Somebody who weighs 150 pounds might actually get quite a bit more out of this motor because they weigh less, so they're not always maxing out what the motor needs to put out, so that battery might go a little bit further for them, and they might be getting just a little bit more assistance out of it relative to their input than I am. Now let's get into the Ikki itself on the climbs. The Ikki is a lot like its bigger brother, the Mith. It offers good front to back balance, great traction, and a very smooth suspension platform. Unno bikes are designed to be run between 30 and 40% sag, and I settled in right around the 35% range, maybe just a hair over that. And at that setting, the rear suspension is active, it's comfortable, and it provides a lot of traction. It smooths out bumps nicely and it hugs the ground really well. Traction on a lot of e-bikes ends up being the limiting factor because there's a lot of power from that motor. I don't think that's the case on this bike. One, because it offers a ton of traction, and two, because I think there's more traction than there is power from the motor. Of course, at that sag, there's going to be a little bit of pedal bob. I'm not really all that concerned about that on most e-bikes, but on this one, because you're getting a little bit less love from the motor, you do notice it a bit more. But I did firm up the pedal platform a little bit more on the Ikki than I did the Mith because of that. I know that the Ikki and the Mith have the same reach, the same chainstay, the same head tube, the same wheelbase. I can't really believe it. The Ikki feels quite a bit smaller than the Mith. It is just a little bit more manageable, especially in tighter terrain, and maybe that's all in my head, and the only difference is the weight and the power. The lighter weight platform on the Ikki helps quite a bit in terms of uphill handling. There is less of a wrestling match on uphill switchbacks and technical terrain. And of course that's offset a little bit by a reduction in power, but overall I'd say the Ikki is a better technical climber than the Mith, if only for the easier to manage weight. So now let's get into the downhill performance on the Ikki, and it is up there with some of the best for an eMTB. The climbing penalty you pay for a lightweight reduced power system is negated and then some on the downhill, and descending on the Ikki might just be the closest to a pedal bike experience that I've ever had. The Unno Ikki suspension design is just phenomenal at small bump performance. It handles that small trail chatter really, really well, and it makes for an incredibly smooth ride. That comes across in the form of increased traction and comfort at both high speeds and low speeds. The suspension system isn't just about the small bumps though, it also shines on those bigger hits and in the mid-stroke. The deep travel and the really supportive nature of the suspension keep you stable and in control even on some of the roughest hits around. And all of that equates to more confidence and composure. In fact, I usually take a ride or two to work out all the kinks on a bike before I really start getting after it. It took me about 2 or 3 corners on the Ikki to realize that this bike rips and I could do whatever I wanted on it. I even hit a drop that I pass on 99 times out of 100 because it's super sketchy, it's really weird, and it's frankly kind of scary. I was feeling good enough on my first ride on the Ikki that I hit it. There is something about the suspension performance combined with the lightweight platform that makes the Ikki really easy to ride for an eMTB, especially when it's compared to the Mith. The Mith is a bit of a wrestling match, and the Ikki, you just don't really notice that it's an e-bike. Yes, there is a little bit more weight on the Ikki than there would be on a pedal bike or a comparable pedal bike, but at most it's maybe like 5 pounds. The way it handles and the way the suspension works, that extra weight just kind of disappears. If you did not know it was an eMTB and you just jumped on it and started riding it, I honestly don't think you could tell. The handling on it is really, really light for an e-bike. It's very easy to manage. Of course, it is very stable due to the geometry, but the bike doesn't feel like a wrestling match in every corner or in every line change or bunny hop like a lot of e-bikes do. Cornering on the Ikki is pretty special. The bike's suspension design works to keep you just glued to the ground. And then the geometry keeps things stable enough yet not super cumbersome. Whether you're hitting flat, loose, bumpy corners or just smacking high-speed berms, the Ikki holds its line really, really well and carves a really nice arc around a corner. And I think that's because just like the Mith, it feels very mullet, where that back end feels proportionally smaller maybe compared to the rest of the bike. Either way, it feels very quick and agile and maneuverable. So let's make a couple of comparisons here. We've been making one this entire time, Unno Ikki versus the Unno Mith. And this comparison is just a no-brainer. Rarely do you get bikes that are so similar. The geometry and travel numbers are identical. Interestingly, these bikes do not feel all that similar out on the trail. Sure, they both get after it on the descents, but the Mith is more of a heels down and plow type of bike, and the Ikki is more agile and fun and way easier to ride. It takes quite a bit less upper body strength to manage. Of course, the trade-off is the Ikki feels far less helpful on the climbs, and your rides aren't going to be nearly as long. The battery capacity is a pretty big difference, with The full power Bosch system on the Mith and a 750 watt-hour battery, 5,000 vertical feet rides are really not all that unheard of, and you're not even getting half of that on the Ikki. Now let's compare this to the Santa Cruz Heckler SL. Up until this point, that bike was the most un-e-bike feeling e-bike that I had ever ridden. I think the Ikki gives it a run for its money. Yes, the Heckler SL has a little bit less travel, a little bit lighter weight components or lighter duty components, and maybe a slightly different intended application, but overall I think they are fairly similar. They both go fairly hard on the downhill. But yes, the Heckler SL is quicker, it's zippier, and a little more maneuverable. And at the end of the day, it's a little bit less capable. But in terms of offering an exceptional downhill ride quality, they're pretty tough to separate. Biggest difference for me is going to be in the motor and the drive system. Although the Fazua only has 10 Newton meters more peak torque, it does feel a little bit more helpful than the TQ. And then the capacity issue, where the Heckler SL has a 430 watt-hour battery, so you can do quite a bit bigger rides on it. When we did our lightweight eMTB showdown last year, we got around 3,400 vert on a Heckler SL battery, which is significantly more than the 1,800 I'm getting right now on the Ikki. So who is the Unno Ikki for? I like it for 3 different groups. And the first consists of the eMTB folks who still really like the fitness aspect of mountain biking. They still like getting really sweaty and grunting a bit and maybe even going cross-eyed occasionally while they're redlining their heart rates. I don't understand those kinds of folks, but they exist, and I think that Ikki would be a great e-bike for them. It won't ever make you feel like you're completely cheating. It will still require some effort, and it will still give you a really good workout. And then, of course, the benefit is the downhill ride quality. The second group I like for the Ikki are the folks who are potentially less fit than the people they ride with. Some folks who need just a little bit of help to hang with their partners. So Nike dads and their super fast freak kids, or just the folks whose friends are just a little bit fitter than they are. Folks who might just not have the fitness chops they once had. So if you put the slowest rider in the group on an Ikki while everyone else is on a pedal bike, I think it closes that gap really well. I don't think the Ikki is just blowing all those fit folks out of the water on their pedal bikes. Then the last group of riders who I think will really, really like it are the folks who want an e-bike, but they don't want to be overwhelmed with the e-bikiness of the e-bike. Between the clean, sleek, subtle integration, the not overwhelming amounts of power, the really natural power delivery, and then the lightweight, easy to manage ride quality on the downhill, I think the Ikki is one of the best at offering the most un-e-bike e-bike experience. And then let's add this in. Let's add in the group of folks who I don't think will like the Ikki. And here I'm thinking of folks whose friends all have full power e-bikes. If you're trying to hang with the full power e-bikes on this thing, it's not going to work. You're going to get dropped so fast, you're going to fall off the back of the group. And either your friends are waiting for you or you're dying and still not hanging. And it's also not for the folks who want to just cruise up the mountain without putting in too much effort. Anyway, that's going to do it. Thanks for sticking around. We'll see you next time.